and well during these unprecedented times. As it is now 9:30, I now open the further hearings of this examination of the North Hertfordshire Local Plan 2011 to 2031. My name is Simon Barclay. I'm a planning inspector and a chartered town planner. I've been appointed by the Secretary of State to hold this examination into the soundness of the local plan. You should all have read my general guidance note, which sets out the purpose of the examination hearings and my role, etc. And you will, I'm sure, also have read my special guidance note about the virtual hearings. Everyone should also have read the privacy notices on the examination webpage. Even though I trust entirely that you have all read all of that, I do just want to emphasise a couple of general points about the use of Zoom for these hearings, if I can. We won't be using the document sharing facility on Zoom, and please don't hold any document or anything else in front of your camera. And also please make sure that no one else appears on your camera either. If you haven't already done so, could you please sort of clear your background of any personal information, or if you prefer, Zoom does allow you to blur your background. And that's because, in essence, you mustn't share any personal information during the hearing, either yours or anyone else's either. The chat and reaction facilities in Zoom, yeah, please don't use those under any circumstances. And I should say that anything that's posted in the chat, I will ignore. I won't be looking at that. If you've joined using Zoom, but you don't want your face to appear on the screen at any point, then you can turn your camera off. That's absolutely fine. I did set out in my guidance note what you should do if you do experience interference or any other sorts of IT problems during the session. So do have my note about that to hand just in case. But if all else fails, then please contact Mrs. St John Howe. Mrs. St John Howe won't generally be appearing on the screen as she was just now, but she will be observing the hearing sessions to help with any problems, and she'll be on hand to provide assistance whenever needed. So those are the general sort of ground rules, if you like. So in terms of the procedure then, for each hearing session, I'll ask everyone to join with their microphone muted and with their camera switched on. That's just because I'd rather see people's faces on the screen rather than be talking to a blank screen all the time. But as I have already mentioned, if you don't want to be visible, then that's absolutely fine. You can have your camera switched off. At the start of each hearing session, I'll check who's appearing at that session. So I'll do a brief taking of the register, as it were, just to ask, well, just to basically check that who is supposed to be here has actually arrived. I'll then lead the discussion, introducing each topic in the normal sort of fashion. I'll ask sorry, do bear with me. The person I'm putting my question to unmute their microphone. And I think maybe when you speak for the first time, it would be helpful if you could remind us of who you are and where applicable, who you represent as well. And when you've finished speaking, please do make sure that your microphone is switched off again. I'll then turn to the next person, or I'll hear points from anyone who's raised their hand. So if you, that's the virtual hand, not your actual hand. So if you do wish to contribute to the debate, then please use the raise hand facility in Zoom. I don't know if you've got anyone joining by telephone actually, but if you have joined using a telephone, then to raise your hand, you press *9 on your keypad to raise your hand. I would ask that everyone please remains patient. If you've raised your hand, I can see on the right hand side of my screen here who's raised their hands and indeed the order in which hands sort of went up, which is quite helpful. So, but please be patient. I can see that you've raised your hand, and I will come to you in due course. When it's your turn, please make your contribution brief and focused, and do adhere to the agenda of the point or points being discussed at the time. You don't need to repeat your full case in detail or give any sort of formal presentation or anything like that. And please, 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 always bear in mind that I've read your representations and your hearing statements. I will terminate the discussion on any particular topic when it seems to me that I've enough information. And as we move towards the end of each topic or subtopic, I'll ask the council for their comments on the points raised if I haven't already done so before moving on. As well as a break for lunch, I'll be taking short breaks during the hearings. I think in truth, I will probably be taking more breaks and longer breaks than I did do in the previous real life, as it were, face-to-face hearings. So hopefully that's reassuring to everyone. When the hearing is adjourned for a break, please turn your camera off and mute your microphone or your telephone if you've joined that way. That is quite important because the live feed, that's the streaming of the session and the recording, can't actually be stopped during the adjournment. So that will continue to roll. So anything you do or say will be broadcasted if you don't turn your camera and microphone off. But also please don't log out or leave the hearing session during the adjournment. If you do that, you'll have to reconnect back in and come back through the lobby to rejoin us again. When the hearing resumes after a break, please turn your camera back on, but keep your mic muted if you would. At the end of the hearing session for each topic and at the end of the day, at the end of the session, I'll then ask all participants to log out of the Zoom meeting, and then the following sessions, you should all have separate joining emails for those. So I'll get you to log out at the end of each session or at the end of each day. Yeah, I should mention that we'll be using my matters and issues papers as the basis for our discussions as we did at the previous hearings. And I should also mention that I'll be taking notes of the debate as we go along. So yeah, as in real life, you may find that my head is down quite a bit like that as I'm sort of concentrating and taking notes. I'll try my best to multitask and keep eye contact as much as I can, but please don't be put off if you're talking and I'm looking downwards. Also, please don't be put off if you're talking and I'm looking upwards. But that's because I've got your faces on a separate screen, which I'm looking at now. So when I'm looking upwards, I am actually looking at you. So yeah, hopefully that's all reasonably clear and everyone knows what they're doing and how the hearings will be run. So are there any questions about what I've just said, or are we all good? Well, I can't see any hands raised, which presumably is good news. In which case then, what I'll do is, as I say, I'll ask everyone to very briefly introduce themselves. So I'm going to simply take the register for the day. And I think perhaps if when I call your name, if you just unmute very briefly, introduce yourself with a brief salutation, and then I can move on to the next. So for the council, I have Ms. Ormsby.
Good morning, sir.
Ms. Caroline Daly.
Good morning, sir.
Mr. Smith.
Good morning.
And Mr. Lee of ORS.
Good morning.
Okay, thank you, very good. Those, as I understand it, are the people appearing for the council today. So in terms then of other participants, in no particular order, I don't think. For Ash Hill, I have Ms. Sophie Stocker.
Good morning, sir.
For White Peak Planning, on behalf of Bloor Homes, I have Mr. Howell Williams, QC, and Mr. White of White Peak Planning.
Good morning, sir. Good morning, sir.
For CPRE, I have Mr. Griffiths.
Good morning, sir.
Good morning, Mr. Griffiths. For the HBF, I have Mr. Berrant.
Good morning, sir.
For Letchworth Garden City Heritage Foundation, I have Mr. Ames.
Good morning.
And for Luton, I have Mr. Bedford and Ms. Barker.
Morning, sir.
Good morning.
Morning. I also have Mr. Dorman.
Good morning. Yes, thank you.
Mr. Rigg.
Good morning, sir.
Mr. Norgan.
Hello there.
Mr. Aspinall.
Good morning.
Mr. Burrows. Are you with us, Mr. Burrows?
Inspector Mr. Burrows hasn't joined us yet. He was possibly going to join by telephone, but I haven't had any contact from him this morning. So if he joins later, I'll let you know that he's joined us.
Thank you, Mr. Singenhow. I have representing both herself, Mr. Barry Cottier, and also Ms. Claire and Mr. Barry Brown. I have Ms. Caroline Cottier.
Hello.
Hello. I have Ms. Cheryl Pears.
Good morning.
I know that I'm told that Ms. Hamilton isn't joining us this morning, or hasn't yet at least. I have Ms. Gross. Are you with us, Ms. Gross?
No, Inspector, no, I don't think she's joined us either. She hasn't, we haven't seen her yet.
Okay, thank you, Mr. Singenhow. For Pigeon Investment Management, I have Mr. Snowling. Do we know if Mr. Snowling's here? Mr. Singenhow? Do we know if Mr. Snowling is?
As far as I was concerned, he was, but it doesn't appear that he's still with us.
Ah, okay. Well, maybe he's experiencing some problems. Let us see. For Save Our Greenbelt, Mr. Hawkins.
Yes, good morning, Mr. Barclay.
Good morning. For Save the World's First Garden City, I have Mr. Coates.
Good morning, everyone.
I have Mr. Stafford of White Young Green for Taylor Wimpey.
Morning, sir. Thank you.
And from Savills, on behalf of the Crown Estate, Mr. Dixon and Mr.
Good morning,
Baker.
sir.
Good morning. And is Mr. Baker here as well?
Yes, good morning, sir.
Thank you. For Transition Town Letchworth, I have Ms. Sananda.
Good morning.
And Mr. Lovegrove.
Good morning.
Good morning, Mr. Lovegrove. And for DLP, representing Welbeck Strategic, I have Mr. Goodall.
Good morning, sir.
And Mr. Roberts.
Inspector, Mr. Roberts will take over from Mr. Goodall if there's any difficulty in connection.
Okay, thank you. So we've got one or two people that I was expecting that haven't arrived. Is there anyone here who is present, but I haven't called your name? If so, if you would raise your hand, I'd be grateful. Okay, very good. Right. Just before then I move on to the first matter for today, are there any questions? I don't see any raised hands. And on that basis, I'll assume that we don't have any. Okay, good. In which case then, without any further ado, let us turn to matter 21, the objective assessment of housing need and the housing requirement. So, yeah, there's obviously quite a bit, I think it's fair to say, has occurred since last we met. My assumption is that people have sort of kept track of events, etc. So I don't intend to sort of go over all of that. But suffice to say that the most recent event has been the publishing of the 2018 based projections and the council's position in relation to that, as set out in ED 191A. Now, I suspect that my questions here are, in the first instance, going to be for Mr. Lee. Would that be right?
That's correct, sir, yes.
Okay, very good. Okay then, so in a nutshell, Mr. Lee, let me see if I've got the general gist right before I then look more forensically at the detail. So I think that's sort of set out in paragraph 10 of ED 191A, which is that to arrive at an OAN on the basis of the 2018 projections, you have taken the ONS 10-year migration trend and added to that an adjustment for suppressed household formation, converted that figure into a figure for dwellings, and added a 10% uplift for market signals. That's right?
Yes, that's correct.
Good. Okay. Well, that all sounds simple enough on the face of it. What I do want to do, as you might expect, is look at the detail of that. So the first step then is to look at the official population and household projections. And we have from ONS the 2018 based projections, yes?
Yes.
And those projections then, well, are they? They're the starting point. Is that right?
Yes, based upon the PPG relating to the previous MPPF that the plan's being examined under, that set out that the starting point for establishing objectively assessed need for housing was the latest official projections. And as we stand at the moment, the latest projections are the 2018 based figures from the ONS. What is somewhat different now to when the PPG was published, originally, there was one set of projections that was published at that time by CLG, whereas now the ONS publish a principal projection and a number of variant projections. So we've looked at the principal projection, which is based upon a 2-year period to establish migration trends. But what we've proposed, consistent with what we proposed at the original hearings, is that it's better to take a longer term perspective, and therefore we've focused on the 10-year migration variant scenario from the official projections.
Yeah, if I can just stop you there. In terms of planning policy and guidance, do we know which of the 3 variants is the starting point projection?
Bear with me. In terms of the PPG, the relevant section is ID2A, and bear with me, I shall bring up the paragraph. It is paragraph number 15, which is headed, "What is the starting point to establish the need for housing?" And that sets out that household projections published by the Department of Communities and Local Government should provide the starting point estimate of overall housing need. And then paragraph 16 goes on to say the government's official population and household projections are generally updated every 2 years to take account of the latest demographic trends. Now, as I said in the introduction, when that was written, there was only one set of figures that was published, and it was published by the Department of Communities and Local Government. Now, the government's official population and household projections, the responsibility has been transferred. The ONS, the Office for National Statistics, were always responsible for the official population projections, but they are now also responsible for the official household projections. So in terms of the starting point, we have the latest projections, but we have no guidance to specifically say which scenario we should take. Evidently, we did discuss this at some length with regard to the SHMA, because whilst we only had one projection published as the starting point there, one of the adjustments that we made was to take a 10-year migration trend. And in that instance, when we were looking at the original SHMA, and also with the update when the 2014 projections were published, in both situations, the 10-year trend led to a reduction from the original starting point. Now, here, the principal projection, which we could take as a starting point from the ONS projections based upon 2-year trends, gives a lower number than the 10-year projection. But whether or not we take the 10-year projection as the starting point, or whether or not we go and take the 2-year principal projection as the starting point and then go and move from that starting point onto the 10-year migration variant, I think, or if we just take the 10-year migration variant as the starting point, it is appropriate, for the same reasons as we discussed previously, to focus on those 10-year figures.
Okay, so is the short answer then, no, planning policy and guidance doesn't tell us which of the three to choose, and we have to exercise judgment in deciding?
Indeed, there's nothing specific within the planning policy guidance that directs us to any one of those scenarios.
Yeah, okay, and so you have used then the 10-year migration, the 10-year trend, if I can refer to it that way for sort of shorthand. Yes, we did discuss this previously, what, 2 years ago now, something of that order.
It was what?
Pardon?
It was a while ago.
Yes, let's call it that, a while back. So things, though, many things, in fact, have changed since then. So why does the 10-year trend remain, in your view, the most appropriate to use? And it's quite an important question, because it does lead to potentially significantly different outcomes, doesn't it? Which scenario you use?
It does, and many things have changed in the intervening time. However, the rationale for using a longer-term migration, all of the reasons for doing that remain the same. That is that migration patterns vary from year to year. There is a tendency for migration to be cyclic. And if you take a relatively short period, you end up risking projecting forward either a peak and sustaining a peak for the entire projection period, or taking a trough and and sustaining a trough for the entire projection period. Now, what we saw with the 2012 and the 2014 based numbers is that they were relatively high compared to the long-term trends, and we argued at that time that they were too high. We shouldn't be sustaining a projection based upon a peak, but we should take a longer-term perspective, and that gave us a lower number. What we're seeing now is the principal projection based upon 2 years being based on, relatively speaking, a trough, and taking that and projecting it forward would assume that.
Sorry, bear with me, Miss Lee. Mr. Aspinall, I'm not sure what you were showing in front of your screen there. It looked jolly interesting, but I have asked that people don't hold anything up, any documents or anything like that, up in front of their camera. I don't know if you were just reading the other side of that sheet or what, but either way, if you could keep documents away from the camera, I'd be grateful. Yeah, okay, so migration, this is going to be quite a difficult question, I suspect, but migration, you say, yes, tends to go in cycles of peaks and troughs. That is something that has been happening, has it, for a long time?
Yes, I mean, that is something that is seen, and migration patterns vary depending on a range of factors, and migration patterns vary in different places in different ways at different times. So a recession will have a different impact, or a period of boom will have a different impact on different places in different ways.
So the cycle then, takes into account things like recession, if I can put it this way, a kind of boom and bust sort of cycle.
Indeed.
Is that right? Do we know anything about how the current pandemic might affect that cycle?
I think, well, firstly, to recognise that the figures that we're looking at are the 2018 based figures. So the most recent data that informs that is the mid-2018 based mid-year estimates. So any data associated with the pandemic is not included within these figures. In terms of what the potential long-term implications of that are, at this stage, it is difficult to know, insofar as obviously there are a range of different factors that will come into play. And the ONS are or have been consulting on the way in which that they will deal with that in future projections, insofar as they're looking at variant scenarios that may isolate the impact of the pandemic out of the future scenarios. But really, I think that to go and hypothesize about what that might be is going beyond where we are with data at the moment, and we have to bear in mind that we are working with projections. So projections look at past data, trend-based data, and project it forwards. We are not dealing with forecasts whereby we are estimating or trying to establish the likely impact of certain events on how things might change in the future. So it is the projection that provides the starting point. There are certain consequences of the pandemic which may lead to the numbers being lower in future. There are certain consequences which may lead to the numbers being higher in future. I mean, there's been a lot of talk about people moving away from central London and looking at housing whereby they may not have to commute into the city every day. And that obviously could create upward pressure. In the short term, there obviously has been, unfortunately, a higher number of deaths recorded this year than would be normal. Now, within the context of the pandemic as a whole, and what we have to bear in mind is that many of those deaths would have occurred within the 20-year period of a projection anyway, insofar as it's more vulnerable people with underlying health conditions who are more susceptible. So it's more of a phasing than an absolute number of deaths that's likely to be impacted on. But again, this is really going beyond where we are with the data that's currently available from ONS.
So in terms of, I mean, it's migration really, I think, isn't it, that we're talking about here? Is that right? I think what you're saying is, frankly, we don't know in terms of any sort of official starting point figures. We don't know what effect the pandemic might have.
We don't know. There is inherently uncertainty there. What we do know is that looking at longer term periods of trend are more likely to reflect the future the future than if we go and focus on either a number that is at a peak or at a trough. And I mean, in terms of the context, the figures that we were looking at originally in the SHMA, the 2012 based projection, and the 2014 based projection had increases of 13,705 and 13,798 households, whereas the principal scenario from the current projection is 6,393 households. So you can see that that's quite a wide range, whereas from the 10-year migration trends, the OAN figure, the projections that we produced for the original SHMA and the OAN update were 12,700 and 12,100 households, and we're currently at 10,076 households for the update that we've done now, based upon the ONS formation method, which we'll come on to, and it's 11,348 based upon the previous CLG method. So you've got numbers that are much, much more stable. They're not variable in the same way that they are when we look at the short-term periods.
Okay, but that aside then, you say that the 10-year migration figure is the right one to look at because because it is what it is, it looks over a longer period.
It's more stable, and that's a position that we've consistently taken. We took it for the Luton study, and it was endorsed by the Luton local plan inspector. We took it for the East Hertfordshire study, and it was endorsed by the East Hertfordshire local plan inspector. We took it for the Stevenage study, and it was endorsed by the Stevenage local plan inspector. And we took it for Bedford, and it was endorsed by the Bedford local plan inspector. It's been a consistent approach that we've taken, and in places it puts the number up, in places it brings the number down. But it gives us a much more stable position rather than having numbers that are far more variable as you get when you look at shorter term trends.
Okay, before moving on, because you know, selecting which trend to use is, I think we've established that the first step, isn't it? Picking which is the right starting point. So what I think I want to do is hear from anyone else. I can see that Mr. Norgan has indicated, is to hear from anyone else on this particular issue, on the selection of the 10-year migration trend rather than one of the other two projections. So Mr. Norgan, first of all.
Can you hear me?
I can now, yes.
Good, okay. Well, the first thing I'd like to say is that the ONS themselves are not happy with the 10-year trend data because, for one thing, it uses several different methods of calculating. There's 3 different methods, I believe. So they are not happy with that. Obviously, they are most happy with their principal variant, which uses, in fact, only 2 years data for the inter-UK migration. But the point was made about migration that we can't look forward to see what migration is going to be. But we do know for sure, I would have said, that it's going to be very different to what it was in the past. If I could give you just a few reasons why that might be. Basically, it's because of the position on flights, I think. That's one of the main ones anyway. That the...
Apologies, Mr. Norgan, did you say flights?
Flights.
Flights, thank you.
Yes, because obviously quite a large percentage of migrants come in by air. And if we look at the figures, the Heathrow traffic has dropped to just 19% to what it was 12 months ago. The latest ONS report shows percentage drops in flights, I think, or I'm not entirely sure looking at my notes here, but coming from the source country, up to 94% drop there. Another way of looking at the migration position is via the number of visas which have been issued. And according to Migration Observatory, from April to June, there was a drop in visas of 99% for study, almost to zero there, 96% for skilled workers, and 90% for family visas. So there's actually been a tremendous drop in the number of people coming into the country. So although we don't know exactly what the migration position is going to be in the future, we do know that there's been a tremendous change to it. And I think once you get a tremendous change, a big event like this, that you can't go on plowing on with what has been happening over the last 10 years. So the better thing would be to actually start really from scratch with an understanding of migration. But of course we can't do that. We have to choose one of those 5 variants. So it would seem the obvious variant to choose under this circumstances of migration would be the low migration variant. I think that's the major point that I can make, that we're in a completely different situation to where we were 2 years ago. And ORS do not seem to have taken that into account in the slightest. Not only do we have a migration problem, but we also have the problem of knowing where we are economically, and also what the housing market is going to be like in the future. It is a completely different changed position. To carry on working on 10-year data after such an event as this seems incredibly wrong. I think that's all I'd like to say at this point.
Thank you, Mr. Norgan. Ms. Fernanda.
Hello. Yeah, I just wanted, firstly, I thought it might be interesting to get a bit of clarity on whether the approved plans for the other areas that were listed were actually approved using the 2018 data, or were these plans approved before that was available? Because that's quite pertinent to whether actually other inspectors, well, you know, the position other inspectors have taken, and that wasn't clear to me from Mr. Lee's, was it, presentation. I think one of the important things... I can
answer that one if you like. That was before.
Before, so actually it's not quite...
I think we've got that wrong. I'm sure they'll tell us.
Okay, thank you. That's important, I feel, to the point. I'd just like to throw in Brexit, really, because we are leaving the EU at the end of the year. And I think actually, you know, to say that migration will continue the same would, I think, be a very bold assumption, given the country. One of the reasons that I think everyone believes that the Brexit vote went through was actually to do with migration. So to expect it to continue to the same after a public vote to leave the EU to try and fix it, I think would be, that's quite a rash assumption, I think, and one that needs to be tested. The other thing I'd like to, I follow up the previous speaker and actually saying the ONS have actually stated that actually the internal migration data has had some problems for some time, which they've been trying to fix, and that's been overestimating the actual populations in areas. So if that's true, the 2014 data that the original plan was based on a problematic set of internal migration data. So to then follow the logic that we should be trying to get a number that's in line with what we got in 2014 doesn't strike me as very robust, because actually it could be that that's the problem data and the 2018 data is a fixed set of data. So, you know, and particularly with 2016 forecasts, when we sort of looked at them along the way, they were starting to show what we're seeing in 2018. So actually, to keep trying to match up and not change from 2014, when the ONS analysis of how that data was come to suggests it wasn't robust, I have huge concerns about. I mean, if we were building on brownfield sites, it may not be something to get too worried about, but when we're going to dig up our green belt to actually, you know, put housing in that might not be needed, this is a really, really serious issue to get this right. And I would say the ONS has probably given a deep amount of thought to correcting this data, and we're kind of ignoring it by using the 10-year trend again. What people are sort of implying it's a 2-year trend. It's only a 2-year trend on internal migration to sort out the problems in the data. It's actually the principal projection is a 5-year trend in terms of migration and population growth, natural population growth. So I would suggest actually that actually we should, just because we shouldn't be modelling to the 2014 data, we should be looking at all the evidence as to where the data has the best quality and using the best quality. And I think the ONS has the best guidance on that. So that's what I'd just like to add to the discussion.
Thank you. Mr. Aspinall.
Thank you, Mr. Barclay. One of the problems I see with North Herts is that they're constantly looking for ways of reducing the number of houses to be built in this district as against looking for the highest amount. Now, I'd like to ask both yourself and Mr. Lee, first of all yourself, we have a ministerial statement coming out on the subject of the changes to the current planning system, and that includes development of numbers for the OAN. It's expected that will be either next month or the following month, but it's quite clear that it's a complete change in the whole methodology under which the OAN will be devised. Now, the question is to you, Mr. Barclay, is that going to apply to this local plan? Because there is an implementation period set out in that paper, and it would appear then that what the ONS came out with is redundant. To Mr. Lee, I'd like to ask him, presumably he's read the changes to the current planning system. Has North Herts District Council made any effort to analyse the position in respect of that new methodology, taking into account all that's said there, and it's wider than what the ONS have taken into account, and what sort of projections have they come up with in that? Now, they must have done that, I assume, otherwise they would be standing in a stagnant position. Thank you.
Yes. Okay. You will know, Mr. Aspinall, that by and large, I'm not here to answer the questions, but rather to ask them. But in this instance, I will help you insofar as I can. As I understand it, yes, the government may well publish reasonably soon the new what's the word I'm looking for? The new formula for the standard method, it's called, for arriving at an OAN. But that hasn't been published yet, unless it's happened this morning. So I don't know what that might look like, or what it might say. I think what I'll do as well with the point that you put to Mr. Lee, yeah, I'm not really in the market for sort of direct sort of cross-examination like that. So perhaps Mr. Lee, if you can pocket Mr. Aspinall's query along with the others that we've heard so far, and I'll come back to you in due course. Does that seem a suitable way of dealing with things, or have you heard quite a bit and you'd like to deal with that now before I move on to others that have indicated they want to speak?
No, if you want to carry on going around, and then I think there may well be other similar points that are raised, and it's helpful to just deal with them all together in the round.
Yeah, okay. If it does seem like you're becoming overburdened at any time, do let me know. Ms. Cotier.
Yeah, hello. Okay, so please, if my camera doesn't work, I've switched it on, but it will probably turn on when it feels like it. So it seems to be in that kind of mood this morning. So what they said previously about the inspector for the Luton local plan, Jeremy Yule, saying that he agreed with the 10-year approach and endorsed it, that wasn't exactly the case. He said in his final report, and that report is easily obtainable, and it was dated August 2017, that the objectively assessed needs for Luton were still unclear in their indication, and he stressed that it would be necessary for another OAN study to be undertaken, a joint study with Central Beds and Luton together. And I looked into whether that had actually taken place, and there are several versions of the SHMA floating around. We've got the old version, which was dated 2015. Another version was then put out in 2017, but it just really reused the old figures. And then the most recent one that's come out, again, it's just tweaked the old figures, and they haven't actually undertaken a whole new OAN study at all. And I checked that with Luton Council directly, and I have the emails that flowed between us to support that. So to say that it was endorsed by the inspector is a bit misleading. He was very uncertain at that time. And then the other thing I want to point out is that I was going back through the North Hertfordshire SHMA, and I was looking at the household projections and the dwelling requirements that was dated on the 11th of January 2013, and the scenarios that they used for their possible projections were quite surprising. So there were like 12 possible scenarios that have been used in this, and they range from just 5,500 dwellings to 15,800 dwellings, which was ultimately the scenario they went with. So what I want to do is just to, as we've been talking about the various migration scenarios, immigration falling, I just want to go through them, because I think this will give us some, well, it stresses the fact that it varies and it is not an exact science. So we really do need to respond to things as we see them now and use common sense to project into the future. Because if we're just going by old patterns that weren't even accurate anyway, because they just tweak and they add data on. Anyway, so back to that. So in figure 12 of the SHMA, they've got this summary of a 20-year dwelling delivery requirements, and they start at the beginning with the dwelling delivery requirement is 5,500 only, and that's in a case scenario of zero migration. That's if everybody stopped moving altogether, which, okay, it's probably not going to happen. Then they've got nil net migration, and it went up to 5,900. Then they did the version East of England plan excluding Stevenage, 6,200, and so far we're so far away from the figure. And it continues, 7,700 low trend migration if we exclude Great Ashby, then 9,100 houses if it's a mid-trend migration scenario excluding Great Ashby, 10,200 if it's a high trend migration, if it's jobs-led, 10,700, low trend migration including Great Ashby. That could be the one to go for, because we are having a low trend migration, and I don't think that's projected to end any day soon. And if we look at the population projections from ONS, they're saying time and time again now that it's dropping, and these projections go back to 2017. Net migration has fallen, immigration has fallen, the population's birth rate is falling. So there's no reason to take the peak that we've just come through and project that into the next 10 years. Anyway, just to finish off the last three, we've got the high trend mid-trend migration, including Great Ashby, was 12,100. And then high trend migration, including Great Ashby, was 13,200. And then the ONS 208 base figures was 14,600. And finally, we have the East of England plan, including Stevenage growth, was 15,800, which was the figure they went through. So they had every single scenario from 5,500 right up to 15,800, but they chose to take the highest possible figure, which at that point, based on the fact that everything seems peaking, maybe they felt that was the right thing to do. However, that's not the case anymore. So why would we project that peak into the next 10 years? We can see we're on a decline. And even the economic forecasters are saying the same thing, which will mean less money to buy the houses that are going to be built. So you could go and destroy hectares of greenbelt only to find that you don't make the money that you thought you would from them. So not you personally, but obviously, but the developers and the council. So I don't know, that's what I wanted to put out there.
Okay, thank you for that, Ms. Cotier. Mr. Coates.
Thank you. The reasons for choosing this, the highest 10-year migration trend, if I understand Mr. Lee, he's doing it because that's what he did before, and he wants to be consistent with what he did before. He's assuming that if he finds that the figures are low currently, then it must be a trough. If he finds the figures high, he assumes that it must be a peak. So the possibilities of anything more enduring in the way of a trend is he discounts as I don't know, out of court in some way. Seems a curious sort of logic that something a bit more durable than a mere peak or a mere trough is not countenanced. The 10-year projection it gives equal weight to the earlier years as to the later years. And if you average that out, the year 2009, for example, would have just as much weight on the graph as 2019 or 2020. This would produce more or less a straight line graph, would it not? Some line which goes soaring up into the skies as if nothing has changed in the world whatsoever. This seems very strange, especially as the ONS seem to discourage its use, probably for precisely that reason. Figures in the lower, the earlier years, in any case, the ONS revised its methodology. It decided that figures before 2017, I think, were on the high side. So that was adjusted. So probably the later years are more reliable because of that reason. ONS doesn't purport to take any account of things like political trends, leaving the EU, pandemics, anything of that sort. And it seems that ORS don't want to take that sort of thing into account either. If that's the case, who is going to take this? Who is going to look into the future and actually say what the likelihood is? Nobody. I would suggest it's in ORS's remit to do precisely that and make an informed long-term view in accordance with what I think we could all say, that we're in for a thumping great recession and there's no way that migration is going to get anywhere near previous levels that it has. If you really don't know, if you really feel that you can't make a judgment as to the future, then why not go for the middle of the road? Try the principal projection. But even that, I think, for most of us would seem pretty over-optimistic. The lowest of the 5 variants, I would suggest, is the only reasonable one to take. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Mr. Coates. Mr. Dorman.
Thank you, Mr. Barclay. Just a few points, if I may. I've spent my life in commercial aviation, so I tend to follow these things quite carefully. And I don't think I think it's worth saying that what is going on at the moment is not going to stop anytime soon in terms of aviation and therefore immigration into the UK. The Air Transport Action Group reckons that international air travel will not recover to pre-COVID levels until around 2025. By mid-April this year, international air traffic in Europe was down by 95% from its 2019 level. That's Frontier Economics. Of the 6,821 aircraft fleet that's in Europe pre-COVID, 5,414 were put into storage. Of those, there are still 3,950 in storage, with lessors having no further homes for them lined up, which is very, very unusual. I spent my life in aviation leasing. So these things are going on, and that must have an impact on the level of immigration. And the only other thing I would like to say is that whereas people are actively discussing the 10-year trend and not happy with it, as I am not, I think the 2-year principal trend is perhaps also too extreme. And for that reason, that's why I've gone for the 5-year low migration trend, because it would have the effect, I think, of factoring in a period of relatively high immigration into the UK, as well as to balance it out a bit better than perhaps the 10-year one would, and also the 2-year one, which would be overly negative, I suspect. Thank you. That's all I wanted to say.
Mr. Hawkins.
Thank you, Inspector. Good morning, everyone. I would just like to make the point that some of these projections would not necessarily be a problem if we weren't in the business of consuming around 85% or delivering 85% of our developments into the Greenbelt. And I would like to suggest that the numbers are somewhat being held artificially higher, because in some ways they create support for exceptional circumstances to erode the green belt in North Hertfordshire. I understand a number of my colleagues have made the plea that this is a time for us to be extremely certain about the numbers that we are going to need. And all I can do, having followed this for 8 or 9 years now, is refer to figures that were quoted back in 2013, have been reported by local MPs at being 7,000. And, you know, that would appear and still appears to be the sort of number that is needed for the North Herts District Council's local plan. All I can say is once the green belt has been eroded, it has gone, and there is a heightened public awareness at this point in time around open spaces, given the very sad circumstances that we all face with regard to the pandemic. So all I can do is urge the North Herts District Council to really and truly think about the numbers as being accurate, so that we don't forsake levels of greenbelt that are continuing to be proposed. So thank you very much.
Thank you, Mr. Hawkins. Okay, Mr. Lee. If I could ask you to reply on the points that we've just heard.
Yes, certainly. I think possibly,
particularly, I'll just mark this out now, but particularly the points we've heard about ONS not being too happy about the 10-year migration trend.
Okay, well, if I start with that point then, and forgive me if it becomes a little technical, but I will do my best to keep it as simple as possible. The ONS position, or if I take a step back, the official household projections are informed by the official population projections, and the official population projections are based upon the trend-based mid-year estimates. Now, the ONS have been improving and revising and refining the way in which they produce the mid-year estimates each year. And it is the case that they have got different ways in which the figures were produced. We have the latest method was introduced, and it provides us with 2 years worth of data based upon the latest method. So 2016-17 and 2017-18 are based upon the most up-to-date methodology. There is then another methodology that is a slightly less refined methodology that was used for the 5 years of data from 2011 to 2016. And then there is yet another methodology which was used for the period from 2001 to 2011. And in the context of the data that we're looking at here, it covers 3 years worth of data from 2008 to 2011. Now, whilst we have 3 distinct methods, they are an evolution rather than a revolution. It is very focused revisions that have been made by the ONS to the way in which the figures are derived. So, for example, between the 2011 to 2016 data and the 2016 to 2018 data, there were improvements to the way in which armed forces personnel is dealt with, and improvements to the way in which students, when they leave higher education and don't re-register with a GP, are apportioned. So there are differences in the way the numbers are used, and the reason that the ONS have used only 2 years worth of data, and I'll come back to that 2 years in a moment, but the reason that they focused on the 2 years worth of data in the mid-year estimates is because there was a change to the way in which migration was calculated. And from a purist statistical perspective, they wanted the projections to be based upon the latest method. Now, they recognize that the alternative internal migration variant and the 10-year migration variant are based upon different revisions of the methodology. But they continued to publish that data, and if they didn't have any confidence in the data, then it would not have been published. There are caveats that they have set out, and it's important that we are aware of those caveats, but it does not mean that we cannot use that data. It is simply that it has not benefited from the most recent refinements to the position.
So we just bear with me a moment.
Yeah.
Okay.
Now, talking about the 2-year trend, I know one of the points made was that the 2-year trend only relates to the domestic migration part of the calculation, whereas 5-year trends are still used for natural growth, and also 5-year trends are used for the apportionment of international migration. The international migration is common in terms of the two scenarios. And that is right. It is only the domestic migration part that is based upon 2-year trends. But it is also the domestic migration part that is most influential to the overall growth. That is where we see the growth coming from. There isn't the same degree of contention or concern being raised about births and deaths. And when we look at international migration, it is almost identical in all of the scenarios. It might be helpful for you to turn up, I think it's document, was it ED 190, the council's document, and the appendix within that document is the paper that we produced for the council.
191A.
Sorry, thank you, Ms. Orsby.
Yeah, I'm glad it's 191A because I have that one.
Excellent. If you turn to page 4 of the appendix, you can see figure 4.
Yes.
And in that table, it sets out the different levels of migration, comparing the 2014 based projections, which we were the basis of the discussion that we had when we met previously, and the 3 different scenarios that we've considered within the 2018 based projections. That's the principal projection, the alternative internal migration variant, and the 10-year migration variant. And what you can see there is that international migration, in terms of the net impact it has, is close to 0 on every scenario. The migration is driven predominantly, almost exclusively, by net growth from domestic migration within the UK. And those are the numbers that vary quite markedly between the scenarios. So when we met previously, we were looking at a starting point with a net gain of 962 people each year. The principal projection that we have in the 2018 projections is a third of that level at 325 as a net gain. And you can see the 10-year migration variant at 638, falling between those two figures. It is domestic migration, it's UK migration, that is the component that is most susceptible to change and that has the largest influence on the overall household projection number. And therefore, it is particularly important that we look at an appropriate trend period. Now, if we turn over and look at figure 8 on page 6, this sets out the position that we have in terms of the historic data. And if we focus only on the last 2 years of that chart, then we have a gain of about 400 people in 2016-17 and a loss of around 300 or so people in 2017-18. And averaging those two out, you get to a point whereby net migration overall, so both international and domestic, is around 0 or just over 0. Now, taking that chart in its whole, clearly we can see that there have been years whereby migration has exceeded 1,000 persons each year, and in almost every year it's exceeded 400 persons each year. And therefore, whilst things may be different in the future, I would hope that we're not going to continue seeing a repeat of 2020 every year from now until the end of the plan period, because that would be quite a desperate situation for all of us. I would hope and expect that we return to some form of normality and to be in a position that we assume that the future migration is going to be based on those 2 years that are evidently much lower than the rest of the trend period, would seem an inappropriate basis for us to be working from. And it is, as we say, this isn't intended to be a forecast. It is a projection. And the 10-year trend has reduced. We can see that in the dotted black line that's on figure 8. It has reduced, and the number that we have at the end of the assessment this time is lower than the number that we had from the previous OAN update. But it's not taking us to a position where we're assuming that net migration is going to be close to 0 overall. There are, shall I move on?
Yes, please, yeah.
There are there are actually 3 other variant scenarios in the ONS projections that aren't set out in the table at figure 4. In fact, there are 2 other scenarios that are relevant to the population. There are 3 other scenarios relevant to the household projections. Now, they are, the population alternatives are the high migration variant and the low migration variant. And those are constrained to different projections in the national population projections. So they continue to use the 2-year trend for domestic migration. They continue to use the 5-year trend for apportioning the international migration, but the level of international migration is higher in the high variant and lower in the low variant when we look at England as a whole. Now, in terms of the projection for England as a whole, it is very clear that the preferred scenario nationally is the projection to which all of the other scenarios are wedded to. So it is the central scenario from the national projections. And if we go and use either the high variant or the low variant, both suffer from the same problem of domestic migration being informed by the 2-year trend based on those very 2 low years relative to the longer term perspective. Evidently, there is a judgment that has to be taken. But we are in a position that we are obviously in quite a not normal position, if I put it that way, in terms of the position now. But we're not looking at a plan whereby we assume that that is going to persist for the entire period. Indeed, we're looking at a plan that started in 2011, so a third of the period elapsed, if not more, predates either Brexit or the pandemic. In terms of where we are, there may be an impact, but that is something that has to be picked up through the planning process, through plan review, rather than us being in a situation whereby we go and take a short-term position and a very low projection in terms of the migration trends. I think the one other thing that I think I need to come back on is with regard to the comments made about the plans elsewhere. And the point that I was making is that they weren't based upon the 2018 based projections. The 2018 based projections hadn't been published at that time. But in each of those instances, we adopted a 10-year migration trend, and it was the principle of a 10-year migration trend being preferred to a shorter term trend that was endorsed by each of those inspectors. With regard to Luton, there is an updated study that was produced, and that's the study that's informing the current examination of the Central Bedfordshire local plan, which is a 2017 study that post dates the 2015 study that was produced for the Luton local plan, and it moves us forward. So we're looking at a more recent study. Now, that work was commissioned by Central Bedfordshire, but it was undertaken in partnership with Luton, and Luton were engaged when we produced that, and that's set out in the introduction to that study. And obviously, in the light of the letter that you sent with regard to this examination and sent jointly with the inspector from Central Bedfordshire, we have reviewed the 2018 based projections for both Central Bedfordshire and for Luton, and I'm sure we'll come on to that. But that has been done more recently across all three areas. And in each case, we are preferring the 10-year trend consistently to what we've done before.
I think that what some people are saying is that, well, look, you know, this isn't an exact science. But of the three trends, you are alighting upon the one that leads to the highest of the three figures, the three potential OAN figures. Given that this isn't an exact science, and things in the world are rather different today than they were even at the beginning of this examination, should greater caution not be exercised, because particularly because in this case we are talking about the loss of land that's in the green belt, and I can't remember who said it, but I have noted it. Once it's gone, it's gone.
I think at the end of the day, the judgment as to what the housing target should be is a judgment for you and for the council. In terms of the objectively assessed need, that is the figure that provides the starting point for establishing the housing requirement and the housing target, as it were. That should not be constrained, and it's set out in PPG that is an unconstrained figure. We've set out within
that's slightly different though, isn't it? Because if you were, for example, to have said to me that the principal scenario was the most appropriate one, that wouldn't be a constrained figure as such, would it? It would just be making a different judgment about which trend was the most suitable. I mean, I take the other point. Yes, you know, an OAN is an OAN, but you know, the requirement in the local plan doesn't necessarily need to be exactly the same as that. There might be various reasons for having a different plan requirement, but selecting a different scenario wouldn't be a question of constraining, would it?
I think if we go back to figure 8, and look at the migration trends there. When you take that in its entirety, I think that it would be very difficult for me to come to a judgment that migration to North Hertfordshire, net migration to North Hertfordshire, should average just over 0 in the context of all of that history, just because the last 2 years give you that average.
Yeah, I mean, I understood your point about the 2-year average, but we have also the 5-year average as well, don't we?
We do have a 5-year average, and as we've said before, the 5-year average previously was the basis for the figure back in 2014 that was much higher than the 10-year average. The 5-year average is now lower than the 10-year average. The rationale for taking the 10-year figure remains the same. The 5-year figure is likely to be much more volatile than the 10-year figure. And that's not something that's specific to North Herts. That's something that's common across all areas because of the way in which domestic migration features.
When you say volatile, do you mean less reliable because, as a matter of principle, it looks over a shorter period?
Yes, I mean, again, if you look at figure 8, you can see that the migration from one year to the next, we've got 2013-14 has a gain of 1,200, and then 2014-15 has a gain of 500. You know, those figures move about quite a bit from year to year. And if we happen to have that 2013-14 number in or don't have it in, and likewise, if we happen to have the 17-18 number in at the other extreme or don't have it in, you end up in a situation whereby the numbers can be much more variable, and therefore it stands to reason that we do have that longer perspective. I think it is also worth recognizing that house building, we show at figure 9, has been lower than the OAN that we had previously identified, and there is a feedback loop that exists in that if housing isn't built, then migration, or if you have lower rates of housing migration, you have lower rates of net migration. You have higher rates of housing, you have higher rates of net migration. And the PPG does direct us that if there has been lower rates of housing delivery, then that is a justification for an increase. Now, if we take a longer term perspective, then I think that it mitigates the need for that increase. Whereas if we take a shorter term perspective, we might have to have more regard to that. But it's looking at it from a position that we're not saying that the number should be the same as it was before. We're saying that the number should be reduced and that the OAN is now lower, but that we shouldn't be focusing exclusively on the most recent period. We should continue to take a longer term perspective.
Okay, I think Mr. Lee, I interrupted you as you were picking up on the points that we'd heard from others. So what I want to do is to let you complete that, just to take some final points from people that have indicated, and then I want to look to take a break rather soon.
Okay. Picked up on. I think that I've covered most of the points that were raised. Is there anything that you can think of specifically that I've not? Oh, with regard to the new methodology, in many regards, obviously, this plan is being examined under the original National Planning Policy Framework. And since that was introduced, we've had the new NPPF published, and we have a standard method for calculating housing need. Now, that yielded a considerably higher number for North Hertfordshire than we had put forward by the OAN in the SHMA. The method that is being set out by government in their consultation yields a number, I believe, of 625 dwellings per year, which is 12,500 over the plan period for North Hertfordshire, which is higher, or albeit much closer than the current standard method, to the number that we've got, but it's of a similar order. I mean, I think that we're at about 11,000, we're at 11,445, and under the proposed changes, and they are only proposed changes, it's not policy, and it is subject to be revised again, and indeed could well be revised again before.
I was going to ask you, yes. So you were talking about using what was put out as part of the consultation.
Indeed,
yeah,
and
we don't know, as I said, that we don't know what that's going to look like. But it may or may not be published soon.
Indeed, and I mean, in many regards, even if it is published whilst this examination is ongoing, insofar as it relates to the new NPPF, and this is being examined under the original NPPF, it isn't something that you necessarily have to have regard to, insofar as it's new policy, whereas obviously the 2018 based projections are relevant because the PPG directs us to use the latest data.
Okay, thank you, Mr. Lee. Mr. Norgan, what I'm going to do is I'm going to take the final points about the first step, if you like, and that is establishing the starting point, which of the three scenarios is the most appropriate. So I'll take final points on that now before taking a break. So Mr. Norgan.
Yes, hello. I was just going to reply to some points that Mr. Lee was mentioning quite some time ago now, actually, so they may not be quite so relevant at the moment. The point was that the population growth is split up into 4 different parts. There's births and deaths, natural growth, inter-UK migration, international migration, and cross-border migration. And if you look at the amount of those in North Herts, the cross-border migration is very small and can be more or less ignored. And even the births and deaths over the period that we're talking about is still also quite small. It's the inter-UK migration which is the most important, as international migration is also very small. So when you're looking at the 5 variants and looking at the low, high, and the principal variation, which I consider to be the medium migration variant, you may think that international migration, as it's expressed in the variants, is not really very relevant to North Hertfordshire. But if you actually look at the figures, you'll find that inter-UK migration actually varies more or less in step with international migration. So when you look at, say, the low migration, international migration variant, you're also getting a low inter-UK population as well. So there is a relevance to North Herts, even though the variants are called international migration. which is really in itself not so significant in North Herts. I hope that makes some sense. Or otherwise, one would wonder why we're talking about international migration when we don't know very much here.
I followed that.
Okay.
Thank you. Mr. Griffiths next.
Thank you, sir. Just a few points then, because I think you've heard a lot up to now. I think obviously what we're looking at here, as Mr. Lee has explained, we're looking at the 2012 MPPF. And with that and the 2014 PPG, we're looking for a judgment based on the latest information. And this is what we now have with the 2018 based projections. And we're talking about a starting point, but I think Mr. Lee is saying, okay, we're looking at the 10-year migration trends, but in that we are having regard to the principal projection, which is 6393. That must be, for all of us, the starting point. And that's what we've been looking at this morning. And yes, it's based on the 2-year migration trends, but internal migration trends. But so much is happening in the period that we're mentioning there. The 2-year period saw a lowering in migration. Now, what we've had since then, of course, Brexit has been mentioned, but the latest, of course, is what's been happening around COVID. You've heard from other participants here this morning the overall effects of COVID and what's likely to happen there, and that introduces some immense aspects of uncertainty into this. So I would say that with the possibility, as we've heard about aviation, from other sources, we've heard about the possible loss of about 40,000 jobs from Luton Airport. And that's the principal employer in this area. It affects things far wider than Luton Borough itself. And so I think with that, with the decline in the economy, with the recession, I think there is so much uncertainty which has been introduced here. So I would say, sir, there are two principles involved here. There's the principal, which is the principal 2-year base projection that should be heeded. And linked to that is the principle. The principle which is the precautionary principle by which we deliver sustainable development. There is this responsibility on you and the council, sir, to deliver this plan in accordance with sustainable development, which includes that precautionary principle. And I think in view of the uncertainty that there is at the moment around the whole business about projections and even forecasting, I think you've really got to sit back on that principal projection and really urge this council, I think, to sit on that and then go for a review. And that review obviously will be informed by a 2022 ONS projection, and imminent, of course, will be the 2021 census. I think in terms of, as we've heard, the green belt and the open countryside are too precious to sacrifice at this time. Thank you.
Thank you. I can see that you're physically raising your hand there, Mr. Rigg. Are you able to use the virtual hand, which would then put you in my list of raised hands that I can see on my?
I haven't been able to locate it, but obviously I'll wait to the end. But I haven't been able.
Okay. I'm aware that you want to come in. I've got Mr. Nunda first of all, and then Mr. Bedford, and then I'll take you after Mr. Bedford, Mr. Riggs. So, Mr. Nunda.
Hi, hopefully just a couple of quick points. One is I don't feel Mr. Lee adequately addressed the issue that the ONS have decided not to use internal migration numbers prior to 2 years ago, because they really don't feel that the data collection, the data analysis, the analysis to produce those numbers was robust enough to put in their principal projection. And I don't feel just looking at sort of historic data and saying it was bigger has kind of addressed the point that the ONS don't think we should be using those numbers. So that's the first thing I don't feel was adequately addressed. And the other thing, which probably might come for later, but we're talking about different methodologies, but most of the government methodologies are for 10 years, looking at dealing with the problems for 10 years. And they tell you about adjustments for 10 years. And then we're kind of using them on 20 years and coming up with very big numbers. And I think we have to be a little careful of that. You don't have to keep fixing the fact that we've got high house prices here for 20 years into the future if we can get it fixed in 10. So I think, as we go forward discussing these large numbers, it would be helpful to actually think about whether we should only be doing some of the adjustments for 10 years anyway. That's just my comment.
Just on the 10-year point, Mr. Nunda, why do you think the ONS don't like the 10-year trend variant?
Well, reading the ONS data, if you read their comments on it, they talk about the fact the methodologies changed 3 times in that 10 years to actually come up with the internal migration number. And then they say that actually trying to make predictions across that with the change in methodologies, it is not a sound thing to do. And therefore, they're only using 2 in their principal projection. So as we look back and say the numbers have changed a lot. Now, I don't know, the ONS haven't actually stated how much the methodology has changed those numbers, but it does suggest to me that the 2014 data may well have been erroneous for the sort of internal migration. And I presume that the people at the ONS look at this stuff in great detail. And that leads me to great concern that we're not, we're kind of dismissing why they've dismissed it. And I don't think we should do that.
I hope they do look at it in great detail.
So do I. So do I.
You're right. Are you aware, Mr. Nunda, of the ONS saying anything explicit about which of the 3 variants ought to be used?
Well, I mean, it's an interesting one, this, isn't it? I mean, I must admit, I've sent an email via my MP to the ministry to try and get some clarity around all sorts of things. Let me see if I can find there. The ONS paper, one of their papers states, the impact of different migration trend lengths, March 2020, states that 10-year migration variant uses 10 years of data for all aspects of migration, internal, cross-border and international. The logic of using a 10-year trend is that it may even out a potentially atypical 5-year period. However, it also risks dampening the effect of more systematic changes that occurred over the 10 years. Moreover, the data over this period have multiple methodological changes. For example, internal migration estimates have had 3 different methods over that time period, which will necessarily impact on the quality of the figures. So that's what, from their paper, that's what they state. And therefore, they've chosen the 2-year for their principal projection. I just feel that they're giving sound advice there, and we're kind of not taking it into account. I mean, why was 2014 right and 2018 wrong? There's no, we can't just assume because we happened to produce a plan in 2014 that was the best data set ever.
So just to be clear that I understand the concept there, I think what they're saying there, from my understanding of it, and correct me if I've got this wrong, is that if you look over a longer period, that can iron out larger changes that are happening more immediately.
Yeah.
Have I got that right?
That's what they said. That's why you might do it, but we've got 3 different methods over that time period, which is why they're not choosing it for their principal projection.
Yeah. Okay.
Whereas actually, if they hadn't been changing the methodologies, they possibly would do. So they obviously consider it significant enough, to think it's better to only use the 2 years.
Okay, I have the point.
Good.
Thank you. Mr. Bedford.
Thank you, sir. So just 2 points, because clearly in many respects, this first issue isn't one that Luton directly has raised as a point of concern, but because reference was made to the Luton Local Plan Inspector's report, I think it is probably appropriate for you to hear from us on this point. You've got the full report from the Luton Local Plan Inspector, Mr. Yule, as your ED4, and the key paragraph on the 10-year trend point is his paragraph 85, where he says there is no certainty about which trends will most accurately forecast what will happen in the future. However, where net migration can show significant variations over time, it is not unreasonable to use a longer-term trend. This avoids making a long-term forecast primarily on the basis of what has happened over only a limited number of years, which may not be representative of what will happen over a plan lifetime. In this case, the SHMA shows there have been significant variations in annual recorded migration from 2001 to more recent years in both Central Bedfordshire and Luton. He then goes on to discuss the specifics of the particular migration trends in Luton and the quality of the data that he was there considering. And obviously, he put all of that in his report. And ultimately, he concludes, this is his 106 and 107, so those 2 paragraphs, that it does remain appropriate to do, as Mr. Lee has said, what Luton had done, which was use the 10-year trends. But insofar as there were uncertainties about the data, he recommended an early review was the right way to deal with that uncertainty issue. So I do identify that for you, because you may find that helps you on some of the things you've heard. The second point, just to emphasise, and it's just to give you the reference, ID 2A 004 2014 0306 is the relevant paragraph in the applicable bit of the PPG, i.e. the old bit of the PPG that applies to this particular local plan, on not allowing the quantification of the need to be, as it were, infected by the introduction of environmental constraints or the availability of land. And the reason for that is the obvious one, that they come in at a later stage of the exercise, and it would be effectively a form of double counting if one were to use, for example, the fact that greenbelt releases might be required as a reason to influence you on the choice of the statistical data. We would suggest that's inappropriate and inconsistent with the PPG. That's something that happens at a later stage of the exercise.
If it helps, I'm not going to fall into the trap of taking constraints into account when considering the OA end.
Good. Well, I'm sure you weren't, sir, but it was just that some of the comments that people have made might have suggested that you should, and I think it was just important to emphasise there is a good reason why you shouldn't. So those were the only points I wanted to make. Thank you.
Okay, I did say that I would take Mr. Rigg next.
Thank you very much, sir. The Great Ashby development, 3,000 houses of which are in North Herts, was justified in the 1990s in assisting Stevenage with their housing requirement. Mr. Lee in his chart has made no adjustment for the impact of that development, which the houses really came on stream between 2001 and 2011, and to include those in the projection going forward would seem to inflate the numbers for North Herts, in my opinion. And when you look at the numbers that Ms. Cottier quoted about the 2000 13 SMART, the difference between the low migration and the high migration figure is 3,000. And therefore, the 10-year projection numbers Mr. Lee is using, or the council are using, I suspect are overstated because of that non-adjustment. Thank you very much.
Thank you. Okay, I have Ms. Cottier indicating, so I will hear from Ms. Cottier. I will then hear from any final comments on the point from Mr. Lee, if he has any, and I will then take a break and then return to talk about the second step, which is the adjustment for suppressed household formation. So, Ms. Cottier.
Yeah, hello. Again, my camera seems to come on when I don't want it and go off when I do want it. So what can I say? I'm really sorry about that. I was looking yesterday at the Luton population estimates, and we're talking at the moment about whether or not the 2-year versus the 10-year is most appropriate. However, considering the date is now coming to the end of 2020, if we look at when the decline began, it's indicating from these Luton population estimates that there was a sudden drop in 2017, an overall UK change and a drop in population. But if we look at just Luton, because we've just discussed the Luton OAN and the inspector's report, there seemed to be a peak of population growth in 2016, but prior to that, it was lower than what it was in 2017. So in 2013, the overall population was 207,400, but I'll just round it to the nearest 200,000. So, and in 2014 it was 210, and then 2015 it went up to 213,000, and then it peaked in 2016 at 215,900, and then it went down in 2017 to 214,700, and then it's progressively gotten smaller. So the tables are showing us that the peak really was the 2014 to 2016 period. But if we look at what happened after 2016, it began to drop, and that was 4 years ago. And that trend didn't reverse. It continued to go down because of the result of Brexit and the uncertainty regarding the visas that people were having. And we also had, we have a high number of Eastern European residents in Luton, which became uncertain about their future if they were to come here. And that affected Luton population drastically, and is going to continue to do so into the next 3-year period. So if we're looking at a 10-year projection, 6 years will have already passed by then on the side of decline in numbers. So if we are looking at a 10-year projection, half of that 10-year period being 5 years, the last 3 have been a decline in the figures of immigration and population overall. It wouldn't point to it wouldn't logically point to us using the highest projection across the whole 10-year period. So that's really what I wanted to say. I don't like it that my camera can't be seen. It looks like I'm avoiding everyone.
No problem. Thank you very much for that, Ms. Cottier.
Although that said, it's probably a good thing because I wasn't looking that great on my last one. So. Okay, so that's all I want to say. Thanks.
Thank you. Is there anything that you want to say in reply before I take a break, Mr. Lee?
Yes.
Just briefly.
Indeed. I think that whilst I appreciate that this isn't a document that's in front of you, given that you had part of what the ONS had said quoted to you. I think it's relevant that you hear another paragraph from the methodology document. So if you don't mind, I'd like to just read that out to you. It comes from the methodology for the 2018 based subnational projections, and it's in section 6 of that document under the heading Internal Migration Data Used. There aren't any paragraph numbers, I'm afraid. But they say the decision to use 2-year averages for internal migration in the 2018 based population projections was because analysis conducted by the ONS showed that the new methods used for the years ending mid-2017 and mid-2018 were more accurate and robust at picking up moves. They go on then to say there is a chance that using only 2 years of data will create unusual averages for local authorities experiencing abnormal migration patterns over this short period. However, we decided that although there may be risks associated with this change, the general increase in accuracy outweighs the impacts on individual local authorities. So that was the reason that they set out for why they took the 2 years as the principal projection. But what it is clearly emphasizing there is that we need to have regard in individual local authorities to the fact that there may be unusual averages that result as a consequence. And going back to what I said previously, for us to be looking at 2 years which average a overall net migration close to zero in the context of all of the previous years, I would suggest is an unusual average that we are seeing in North Hertfordshire, and therefore that is relevant. And as I say, I'm not going to repeat the points with regard to the 10-year migration as to why we would go there. It was suggested, though, that the 2014 data was right and that the 2018 data is wrong. And why is this the case? And I would like to emphasize that we didn't take the 2014 5-year trend data as being right. We moved to a 10-year average and we reduced that number. So we reduced the number from the 2014 based upon the 10-year figure. We didn't simply say that it was right. Again, with regard to the 2018 based position, I think it's just recognizing that we're not taking the highest of all of the numbers. The numbers that we're taking are the 10-year migration scenario. And that is a number that is lower than the 10-year migration scenario that came from the OAN update. It is lower than the 10-year migration that came from the original SHMA, and it's considerably lower than the 2014 and 2012 based projection starting points that we used. So we are in a position that we're not taking the highest number, we're taking a number that is towards the middle of a range of numbers. It just happens to be that within the 2018 based projections, it is the highest of that set. But I think that you have to go and look at all of these numbers in the round, and we're not in a position that we're simply taking the highest number.
Okay, thank you for that. Okay, so I make it now very nearly 25 past 11. I'm going to adjourn until 11:55. So that's a half-hour adjournment. If we do that now, and if I can ask that everyone switches off their cameras and their microphones, please. Thank you. Okay, it is now 11:55, and so I resume the hearing. As I said I would, I will move now then to what I understand, Mr. Lee, to be the second suppressed household formation. Is that right?
Yes, that's right.
Okay, and you arrive at a figure of 1,470 households. Can you tell me how you get to that figure, please?
Yes. The analysis is set out on pages 9, 10 and 11 of the appendix to ED 191A, where we look at what are known as household representative rates.
Yeah.
Now, when the ONS took responsibility for the household projections, they introduced a new method for calculating household formation. When CLG undertook the calculation previously, they used data going back to the 1971 census for all censuses up to 2011. So essentially the period, the most recent period, 2001 to 2011, was only a very small part of the overall trend that was used. The ONS have used a different period in terms of their new method, and they have used only data from the 2001 and 2011 census. Now, at a national level, this has led to quite a substantial reduction in the household formation method, and this was one of the key reasons that the government went and changed the standard methods. The new standard method under the new MPPF was changed very soon after the 2016 projections were published, when this new method for household formation was introduced, because it reduced the number of households that were projected to form at a national level. And the reason for that is that it was basing trends on that 10-year period from 2001 to 2011. So in response to it, the government went and said that you shouldn't use those projections for the new MPPF, that we should continue to use the 2014 based projections because of concerns about the trends that had been observed between 2001 and 2011, essentially in capturing a period when households weren't able to form because of insufficient supply of housing and housing affordability difficulties. Now, the ONS responded to that and confirmed that if the housing wasn't provided, then the trends wouldn't allow households to form. So what we have done is we've looked at this issue in regard to the data for North Hertfordshire, because in some areas, the change in method has had very little impact. In Central Bedfordshire, for example, both the old method and the new method come up with very similar results. In Aylesbury Vale, the number under the new method actually is higher than under the old method, but in North Hertfordshire, it is lower. And what we can see in the charts in figure 12 on page 10 of the appendix is that the probability of people in different age groups representing households, so the chance that anyone is a head of household in age groups, has reduced quite sharply in a number of age groups. If we look at those aged 25 to 29, back in 2001, almost 40% of all people, so the dashed black line, the ONS conclude that almost 40% were household representatives in 2001, but their projections show that that number had reduced to less than 35% by 2011, and assume that the reduction will continue to just over 30% by 2021, at which point the ONS hold the number constant. Now that reduction is seen in each of the age groups from 20 to 24, 25 to 29, 30 to 34, 35 to 39, and we only see the number remaining stable, as it were, once we get to those aged 40 or over, or aged 40 to 45, or 40 to 44 rather. So in all of those younger age groups, there is assumed that fewer of them will form, because fewer of them did form over the 10-year period that was used as a trend. Now, the government has argued that just because fewer have formed in the past shouldn't mean that we shouldn't be providing housing in the future, and it would be wrong to project that forwards. So we've had regard to that, and what we've done is we've looked at what the rates were back in 2001 and how many additional households would form if those rates were returned to. So essentially, we're not assuming that the rates are any higher than they would have been historically. We're just saying that if those rates are returned to, then we have a number of additional households that would be resident in North Hertfordshire that are not counted within the household projections. So the same number of people, the same population, would live in more households, and there would be a need to provide more housing for them. So it is an adjustment where we've based it upon the numbers returning back to those levels in 2001 and applying the representative rates where they've declined to establish that figure.
Okay, so just to make sure that I understand that, then this is about seeking representative rates that are an increase, or household formation that's an increase on what we've seen in the past, but rather it's about what things would look like if there were to be a return to the 2001 representative rate. Have I got that right?
That's right. So figure 13 on page 11 goes and shows that over the 10-year period from 2001 to 2011, so the trend period that was used, there were 797 fewer households as a result of the household representative rates falling. So if if individuals had been able to form households, there would have been 797 more households in 2011 at the beginning of the plan period, and then carrying that forward over the period to the end of the plan in 2031, we would get a further 673 households by applying those rates. So taking those two numbers together, 797 and 673, gives us the 1470 that is set out in the summary at the beginning. So essentially, we're saying that people in those age groups aged under 40 have an equal chance of forming households in 2031 as they did have in 2001. So to mitigate the impact of any suppression.
Okay, and do we know anything about the reasons that lie behind the suppression that you say we're seeing here?
I mean, in terms of the reasons, that clearly there are a range of demographic factors at play, but evidently the supply of housing, if the houses are not there for households to form into, then the households will not be able to form, and that is what the rationale for the figure, or the position the government has taken as to why it is that housing needs to be notably higher than the household projections, and why it is that we need to be looking at an objectively assessed need figure rather than simply taking a household projection figure. when looking at the number of homes needed.
Okay, so it's in part about, you say, the physical existence of homes for people to form a new household in, and what presumably there are other factors involved as well, like whether people can afford to move into those homes and form a household. Is that right?
Indeed. I mean, it is set out at paragraph 15 of the PPG ID2A, and the final sentences of that note that as household projections do not reflect unmet housing need, local planning authorities should take a view based on available evidence of the extent to which household formation rates are or have been constrained by supply. So essentially, this point is responding to that part of the PPG.
Okay, thank you. Was anyone else wanting to talk on this specific subject? A few people. Mr. Nanda.
Yeah, I just wanted to comment that I think, you know, in the original version, there was a look at suppressed households, and it, you know, ONS calculated it for the Stevenage HMA, to my recollection, to be down to 309 dwellings. So now we're saying it's 797, you know, so it seems to be quite a wildly jumping figure, you know, their analysis. I mean, in the original analysis as well, the suppressed households were just seen as something that the market uplift was to address, the 10%. Whereas here we seem to be taking the suppressed households, adding them on, then still doing a 10% uplift. You know, when that was supposed to address the sub, it feels a bit double counting to me.
I'll come on to the 10% uplift after.
Okay, and the other thing I wanted to say is there is an element, I think, you know, that actually we will have suppressed demand for young people. There's no doubting that houses are expensive in North Herts. But I think over the period we're looking at, I think the world has changed rather for younger people as well. More and more are entering higher education. You know, they're taking years out, and you know, there's a different, I think the 1970s, you know, profile for both for women particularly, you know, and for all young people into education and to working life was a very different period. So I think factoring it all back to 2001 during this period of quite a change for how young people's lives pan out, and saying it's all suppressed households might be going a little too far. And even in the last analysis, they didn't project the whole lot out of it, which is possibly why we had 309 suppressed households and not 797. I just think it's gone a bit towards trying to knock the number up, it feels to me, but I'll leave it like that.
So are you trying to tell me, Mr. Nanda, that regardless of whatever reason, my children will be living with me until they're 40?
No, I think there's a need to deal with market uplift. I think we're just getting into a very untransparent way of trying to work out housing need here. I mean, obviously the government's got ideas on how to address this, you know, with their affordability factors in the new methodology. I'm not expecting them to be with you till 40, and I think actually there is a problem with house prices. But I think it may have been overestimated in this 1,470 suppressed households. I think some of the suppressed households are because the children are at university and things. You know, there is other factors playing out here, and we need to be careful not to be upping the number of houses beyond actually what the current ways of living and you know, ways we go through our life are playing out like.
Because it's you say that it's a bit different now in that respect to how things were in 2001. I
think so, yeah. You wouldn't be sending 50%. I mean, I can't remember precisely when we changed to started to increase the numbers going to university, but in 1990 when I went, it was a very small proportion of the population. By the time Tony Blair's changes had come in, you know, that had significantly changed where you went from 18 onwards, you know, and how those first probably years of your work, you know, 10 years of your working life, you know, when they start for most people and when they start to actually get together. And for women in particular, I think the world is a very changed environment from when I started working in 1990s. and actually, what women want from life and when they actually settle down. So I think if you look at the sociological factors going on, we can't just say that the changes we're seeing are just about suppressed households, though I do not deny that actually I would not want to be buying a house as a young person at the prices they are today. I think that is a factor and we ought to think about it. Absolutely must be addressed. I just think we shouldn't pretend that the whole of this change is down to suppressed not building houses. I think there's quite a few changes in society that have changed how we aspire and when we settle down.
Okay, and because of that, I think that what you're saying is that therefore we shouldn't be looking to return to a household representative rate of 2001. Is that right?
I think so. I think we can take some of the trend, at least from 2001 to 2011, and allow that some of it is a real change in the way society, and we live our lives.
So do you think that there should be some figure included for suppression, but not as large as the one that Mr. Lee has included? Is that?
I think yes, that's what I'm trying to say. We should allow for it, but I think it's gone a bit too far. And it's, why was it 309 the last time they did the analysis and now it's 700 and something? It's that, they're both their ORS, whatever their analysis. So why has it changed? Why when they did the analysis, they think there was 309 in the area and now they're saying it's 797. That doesn't make sense to me.
Okay, thank you. Mr. Norgan.
Yeah, hello. The first point I would make is that although we're talking about North Herts here and not the whole of the country, it's worth pointing out that Oxford Economics has done a study on the number of houses in the country and the number of households in the country, and that there is an excess of houses over households by 1.1 million. So Mr. Lee is saying that the situation in North Herts is the opposite of that we haven't built enough houses, but on the ground it would appear as though over the country as a whole anyway, there are quite a lot of extra houses beyond the number of households. Another point I would like to make is that Mr. Lee is saying that this situation started from 2001. Now, if that is the case, why did he not bring up this situation in November 2017 when he could have done, when he was replying to ED 171? And why did he not bring it up actually at the time of when the local plan was first formed, which is, I think, pre-2017, 17 years after 2001? Why did he not bring it up then? Why is he suddenly bringing it up now in 2020 after missing two opportunities to do so? And another point that I'd like to make is that what seems to be happening with this suppressed housing is that Mr. Lee is effectively saying that the ONS 2018 figures are not to be trusted, that there is something wrong with them. What he's basically saying is he rather likes the way that CLG were doing them earlier on, and taking into account censuses before 2001. Now, the 2018 ONS figures are accepted to be the baseline for the calculation of OAN, and they should only be modified under certain circumstances, but I think Mr. Lee is actually pulling them completely apart and saying the ONS don't really know how to do their job. they should have taken if there is a suppressed housing situation, they should have taken it into account. And Mr. Lee is saying they didn't. That seems to be going a bit, well, rather a long way too far to me. So for those three reasons, I don't think there should be any suppressed housing whatsoever. That's my point.
Thank you, Mr. Norgan. Mr. Coates.
Thank you. Just to pick up on Mr. Norgan's point about surplus housing, there is a figure for the southeast. There is a surplus of housing of 5.9% in the southeast region. It goes up to 6.5 in London. The Oxford Economics has become the UK collaborative centre for housing evidence, and I think we need to at least admit there is another narrative here. If I could just quote from something on hidden households, survey data suggests that there are now 400,000 more families or individuals sharing a house with other families or individuals, so-called hidden households, than there would have been had the proportion stayed constant since the late 1990s. These developments are sometimes thought of as evidence of constrained household formation. However, both trends appear to be explained by the higher rate of migration to the UK over recent years. Among UK-born households, average household size has continued to fall, and there has been no rise in the proportion of UK-born hidden households. The uptick in both trends nationally and therefore appears to be driven by a bigger proportion of young, often single, migrants who survey data suggest have always had a greater tendency to share housing. An accompanying development is that there are almost 1 million more 20 to 34-year-olds now living with their parents than there were in 2002. This stark change seems likely to be the result of reduced affordability of housing for young people, but for reasons unrelated to general housing supply. Weak wage growth, particularly since the financial crisis and housing benefit cuts, have disproportionately affected young people, reducing rent affordability for many of them, even if it improves on average. A further factor is the erosion of social housing as an option for young people, with almost 700,000 more of them now having to choose between paying market rents or living with their parents compared with 1996. Tackling these distributional problems directly is likely to be a far more effective strategy to help young people than additional market supply. This is essentially saying that there is absolutely no need to include suppressed households in these figures. It will not improve affordability, and there is already a surplus of housing in the region. Incidentally, 5.9% surplus housing in the southeast. Has Mr. Lee actually thought of making a reduction rather than an uplift on the basis of this? That's all I need to say. Thank you.
Thank you, Mr. Coates. Mr. Griffiths.
Because just to agree with most of the points that have been made here, our statement, paragraphs 12 to 14, sets out our position. But I think I've lived in this area of Hertfordshire for 50 years now, and I have children who are now married who did stay at home with us far too long, probably. But I can certainly attest to the way in which things have changed since 2001. So I think I don't think we can really justify the position as was present from 2001 to 2011 and say that that is the position as we now see it. Certainly not in total. And then I don't think anybody's made the point as yet, but I thank Mr. Lee for his explanation earlier on. But yes, he's come to 797. But he then went on to talk about the period beyond to 2031. And in paragraph 30 of this statement, they've added a further 673 households, thus bringing it up to 1470. And that, again, I wonder why on earth we're then basing that assumption on the basis of 2001 to 2011. It's just getting out of hand. So, I mean, suppressed households is not something we used when we were doing population projections back in the good old days of the Hertfordshire Structure Plan.
Mr. Hawkins.
Thank you, Inspector. It's just dealing with the matter of suppressed households and whether or not they should be included. Clearly, the emphasis is on the young, and we all want to see young people being able to afford homes. And affordability is really the factor that I wish to turn to in terms of whether or not we accept suppressed household numbers as a factor within the numbers overall. I'm mindful of the fact, as we all are, I'm sure, that the pandemic is bringing some real change to retail space within our regions. And as a consequence of that, it's likely, and there are plans afoot for huge redevelopments of retail space to include high-rise flats for young people to enable them to afford somewhere to live. And you know, I believe this is an opportunity on the horizon to make living costs affordable within North Hertfordshire and the whole of Hertfordshire generally, given the fact that that opportunity now exists. It's going to be extremely expensive for houses to be built within the Greenbelt. They're likely to have gardens and spaces of that type, which add to the cost of affordability for young people. So I just would like to make the point that there are lower cost places becoming available. I realise they're not necessarily in the plan right now, but they're certainly on the horizon, which is why I would vote against suppressed household numbers being included at this point in time. And that's all I have to say. Thank you.
Okay, thank you. Ms. Cottier.
Yeah. Okay, so I was saying previously about Luton, but I think this would include all of the figures for the whole plan. We're talking about a plan period from 2011 to 2031, and we're all talking about projections and what may apply or what may not apply, and it's not an exact science. But what we forget is that half of the plan period has passed already. So effectively, we do actually know for an entire 50% of the period that we're speaking of, what came to pass. So for that period of time, we don't need to speak about projections. We can look in retrospection as to what in fact occurred. And then for the remaining 10 years, half of that we know has likely changed dramatically. And what comes during the last period of time, the last 5 years, well, that's an unwritten story. But we do know that this pandemic, the Brexit situation, and the global situation overall, we'll be lucky if economically we remain stable. We're more likely to probably shrink, but just take it that we remain stable. But I don't think we're looking at big periods of growth. And I think most economists and population projections suggest that for the next 5-year period, stable if we're lucky, but probably a decline. So we're actually only really applying this big projection for the last quarter of the plan period. So I think that when I started this engagement with this whole plan process, I thought that the way that the OAM was calculated was an exact science, and I thought that there was a structure that they would adhere to, and it would be less elastic. But what I found out is that there's a lot of negotiation, a lot of uncertainties. But at the end of the day, why are we talking so theoretically about half of a time period that has actually occurred? I mean, when people are born, we've got the birth rates. We know what they were. We know what the death rates were. So when you come into the world, you need a unit of space, and when you die, you don't need it anymore. So we could sort of take the birth rates, the death rates, balance them off against one another. And then we know that once you've been born into a household, presumably you have a bedroom. So you're not really going to need a house of your own until you're 18. So we should be looking at key sections of the population growth at certain key periods and working out logically from there. Well, we have, 3,000 people who have made it to 18. They're going to need some house space. But, and perhaps we should be thinking, and then overall migration and immigration in versus migration and immigration out. So we're talking about it like it's a mystery, but half of the plan period, we actually do know what happened. So why don't we use that as our starting point? And then from there, the remaining half, I haven't probably explained it as well as somebody who works in the field would, but I've done my best.
I understand what you mean.
Thanks.
Thank you. Are you indicating Mr. Coates?
Yes, I am. Just to amplify Ms. Cottier's point, it seems that nobody is prepared to look at likely future scenarios based on what the situation is now. It's all based on the past. And the present situation makes such a radical departure from the past. And it seems a tragedy that nobody is prepared to actually stick their neck out and make some sort of commitment about the likely future scenario, even within the period of the plan. ONS doesn't, and ORS had the opportunity, but they seem to have passed it up. And no doubt when it filters through to NHDC, they seem to want to have, they seem to welcome as higher numbers as possible. So they're not going to. And it seems a tragedy that nobody is going to do this. That's all I want to say.
Thank you for that. Okay, I'm going to go to Mr. Lee now and seek your reply. Two things. I think in particular it might be helpful to just pick out, Mr. Lee, is this question about what figure there was for suppression previously, how you've considered that previously, and also the point about the 673 figure for 2011 to 2031.
Okay. If I take you back to the charts on page 10, so figure 12. And go through the lines that we have on each chart in a little bit more detail. We have a red line that's solid and a blue line that's solid, which give us the rates for men and women respectively. We then have a dashed line, which gives us the combined rate for persons. And we have a dotted line, which shows the 2014 based rates. And what we can see is that the 2014 based rates, on the whole, the lines are relatively flat. So the 2014 based rates were the rates that we used in the original SHMA, and reference was made to the 2016 based update, or the response that we gave to you following the 2016 projections having been published. And in that response, we preferred what was called ONS Sensitivity Analysis 2. Now, that Sensitivity Analysis 2 used the 2014 based rates. So we didn't need to engage with the change in method and the impact on suppressed household formation. The 2018 based projections don't include that sensitivity analysis, and therefore we do have to engage with suppressed household formation. Essentially, the number that we had previously, so in the original study, we had 309 households across both Stevenage and North Hertfordshire combined. So only 100, 150 or so households in North Hertfordshire. That number was on the basis of the 2014 CLG rates being used. So taking those aged 25 to 29 as an example, it assumed that 42%, about 0.42, of people in that age group would be household representatives in 2031. Whereas the data that we have from the ONS method shows that only 32% of those households will be household representatives. So a 10 percentage point difference. It is that difference in moving from the CLG method to the ONS method that means that we've got a much bigger suppression that has to be addressed. So it's not that we haven't taken the opportunity to address it any sooner when we could have. We have used the figures that were used for the original study consistently for the previous updates, but in the absence of those figures, we are now having to address this issue. Now, this is an issue that is very relevant in North Hertfordshire, but it is also an issue that is relevant nationally. And in the government consultation, they've gone and set out quite clearly that the fact that the household projections are lower, the fact that we have this suppressed households, should not change the objective of building homes. And what the ONS have said, it's not that, I think it was suggested that we were going completely against the ONS and suggesting that they don't know how to do their job. I think it was the phrase that was put to us. But what they have said, the ONS themselves have responded to this, and they've gone and said, although the latest household projections are lower than the previously published projections, this does not directly mean that fewer houses are needed in the future than thought. This is because the projections are based on recent actual numbers of households and are not adjusted to take account of where homes have been needed in recent years but have not been available. Therefore, if more homes are built, the increased availability of homes may result in more households forming. The opposite is also true. If fewer homes are built, then fewer households are able to form. And that's what the ONS said in their statement that accompanied the new household projection method being introduced. And that's referenced by the government in their consultation recently on technical changes to the NPPF. So it's not that we've ignored this and we're suddenly looking at it for the first time now. We are looking at it now because previously we've not needed to look at it because we've had the 2014 based variant numbers. We've taken account of it, and the figures that we have are based upon what has happened. As has been pointed out, we know what has happened from 2001 to 2011. And from 2001 to 2011, the figures in figure 13 show that 797 fewer households formed than would have done had those rates not have changed. We also know what has happened from 2011 to 2018, and that shows that there's a continuation of that trend. Now, the analysis that we've done is to take the figures for 2001 to 2011 in the first instance, but we've then also taken the figures from 2011 to 31 and done exactly the same process, and that yields a further 673. So some of that is households we know that haven't been able to form, and some of it is projected households that are unable to form. Now, the ONS actually hold their number constant from 2021 onwards, so it doesn't continue to fall, and therefore the impact is much more mitigated. Much of this is due to suppressed household formation that has already happened in the past, and had the homes have been built, then more households may have formed. I think there are a couple of other points that are worth recognising. Firstly, there have been changes in terms of the social demographics, and when you look at the red lines and the blue lines on the charts in figure 12, we can see that there is an increased probability of females being household representatives and a reduced probability of men being household representatives. And that's partly as a consequence of the fact that women are far more likely to be in employment and to be either living not as part of a couple or being the eldest economically active person in the household. So those changes are captured by the projections. And with regard to university, if children are at university, then they are counted by the ONS in their university town. These rates are only applied to residents in the area. So it's only people living in the area in these age groups that we are looking to apply the household representative rates to. We're not applying them to children who may be returning home for the holidays. Now, evidently, if after graduating, a young adult moves back to the parental home and they become a usual resident in the area again, then they are included within the calculations. But whilst they're at university, they wouldn't be counted because they would be counted as resident in their university town. I think the key thing is PPG is quite clear that we have to take account of this. The government have highlighted the fact that the new method introduces what they consider to be a greater amount of suppressed formation, and the ONS have acknowledged that all they are doing is projecting into the future to produce a projection of households, not a housing need number. The purpose of the study that we are doing is to take those household projections as a starting point, but then take account of factors such as suppressed household formation to establish the OAN, to establish the housing need. So PPG directs us and says we must take account of this. It is a much larger figure than we had previously because the method used in the starting point in the household projections has fundamentally been changed, and it's gone from a position where we were seeing largely no change in these numbers in most age groups to a position whereby all of the age groups for those aged under 40 are recorded as having reduced and projected to continue reducing into the future, and we have to make an adjustment for that.
Okay, thank you. Mr. Norgan.
Yes, the thing that gets me is that if you look at the what makes up the increase in population, which is likely to happen in North Herts from 2011 to 2031, the major part of that is inter-UK migration. The natural growth of people who are resident in the area at the present time is relatively small. So the people who will be moving into these houses that you're considering building are going to be from other parts of the country, from other local authorities. And I would guess that they're probably going to come from London. Now, if there happens to be, for the reasons that Mr. Lee has mentioned, a shortage of houses in North Herts, then surely these people coming from these other parts of the country could move to almost anywhere they wanted to within reason. If there's a shortage here, they could move to Bedfordshire or to Kent or wherever. So this shortage seems to be just a technical situation. I think it would be less of a technical situation if the greater majority of the population increase was coming from natural growth, but it isn't. Mr. Lee has admitted that the natural growth of this area is relatively small. In fact, if you look into the future, it's negative. It starts to become negative. So it doesn't seem to be a real problem to me at all. People can move wherever they want to nowadays. They don't have to come to North Herts. If we're short of houses here, they'll move somewhere else. So I just don't see it as a really serious practical problem. Thank you.
Thank you, Mr. Norgan. Okay, is there anything else on the question of the adjustment for suppressed household formation before I move on? Okay, thank you. In which case then, the next step, Mr. Lee, as I have it, is you undertake an exercise of converting households to dwellings.
Yes, that's right.
Okay, would you like to explain very briefly why?
Well, obviously we are counting in households, and we are looking to establish the number of dwellings. Now, whilst most dwellings are occupied by a usually resident household, not every home is occupied by a usually resident household. There are a number of reasons for that. Some homes may be vacant. Now, normally that is for a short period of time, but it's just to enable people to move around within the housing market. If we had a position where every home was always occupied, you'd have a gridlock position and nobody'd be able to move. There are some properties that are empty for longer periods of time because people are away from those properties. It may be that they've had to move into care homes. It may be that they've died and that their properties are in probate at the time. It may be that people have had to move to another area and are looking to sell their home, but it hasn't yet been sold. So there are a number of reasons why homes may be empty, and there are other dwellings that may be kept by people who have more than one home. So either a dwelling for work as well as a family home, or a second home or a holiday home. As a result, each of the, or we need to recognize that not every dwelling is going to be occupied by a usually resident household. And what we do is we look at the ratio of dwellings to usually occupied households with a usually resident household. So the number of dwellings, a number of dwellings that are occupied, we take that ratio, and we take that ratio from the 2011 census, and we use that to convert from households to dwellings. And as you see, there's an increase there of some 300, just under 300 in that step. And that's exactly the same as we did in the original SHMA and in the OAN update.
Okay, thank you. Is anyone wanting to comment on this particular issue? Okay, thank you. The next step then is to add a 10% uplift for market signals, Mr. Lee, yeah?
Yes.
What are market signals telling us at the moment, and why 10%?
In terms of the market signals, PPG sets out a number of different factors that have to be taken into account. They include factors relating to price and also factors relating to quantity. The factors relating to price include things such as house prices, rents, affordability ratios. The factors relating to quantity talk about things such as overcrowding and homeless households. And in terms of the response to these factors, it is a judgment as to what the appropriate uplift should be. Now, we put forward that 10% should be used as the appropriate uplift at the time of the original SHMA. And we maintain that in the context of other uplifts being applied and being endorsed by local plan inspectors, the relative sort of hierarchy of uplifts suggested that an uplift of about 10% was appropriate for North Hertfordshire. And I think in our response, and forgive me, I don't have a copy of the ED number, but the response that we put to you in the inspector's response to your questions in October 2019. I don't know if anyone has got the ED number of that, but on page 4 of that document, we set out the market signals as they were at that time, along with the figures that had been endorsed by various inspectors and that had been proposed in various areas. And we considered that to be reasonable in that context. Now, in terms of the...
Can I just ask, the document that you couldn't remember you didn't have the reference number immediately to hand.
I've been told it's ED171.
Pardon?
ED171.
ED171. Okay, I thought I had that immediately to hand. As it turns out, I don't. I think you're saying, are you on page 4, that sets out the specific market signals at play here?
It does, yes. It sets out the market signals based upon the most recent information available in October 2019. Now, evidently, we are now in November 2020, and there will have been more data published, and we could recollate a similar table if that was something that would be helpful for you. But I think what it's going to show is that, broadly speaking, we are seeing a similar hierarchy. It's not that North Hertfordshire is suddenly considerably the most expensive or the least expensive place in the list of comparator areas. Where prices have gone up, they will have gone up across the board, and where they've come down, they'll have come down across the board. Now, those changes were in a position where the numbers, the figures that we presented in that document, on the whole, housing was more expensive and affordability ratios were higher than at the time of the original SHMA, when we reached the conclusion that a 10% uplift was appropriate. Now, evidently, at the time of the original study, that uplift for market signals encompassed the response to suppressed household formation, because it was a relatively small component of the overall uplift, but we did include it within that uplift in the original study, whereas we are looking at the response to suppressed household formation separately now. But we are looking at a figure of 10% as being a judgment figure. It's not a precise number, it's not a precise science, and I don't think it would be appropriate for us to be going and saying, well, actually last time we should be looking at 9.2% or whatever it would have been had we taken that number out. It is a broad adjustment to the figures in line with the PPG to take account of market signals. And as I say, we have had to make a very specific adjustment for suppressed household formation, a separate exercise this time, whereas it was encompassed previously, because it has become a far more important part of the, or it's far more substantial part of the overall numbers.
If you would just bear with me one moment. Yeah, I'm just looking at ED 171 now, and I'm just trying to get clear in my mind which particular market signals it is that we're talking about.
So on page 4 of that document, I think it's an A3 page, it sets out indicators on house prices, the lower quartile house price, rents based on average monthly rents, affordability, which is the ratio.
Is this in an appendix to ED 171? I'm looking at page 4 of the main document.
So it's page 4 of appendix 2. So if you keep scrolling down, the numbers restart effectively on Jonathan's note at page 1, and it's page 4 of that. So it's about page 10 of the document.
Thank you.
Apologies.
Right, okay, so we're looking at lower quartile house prices, average monthly rents, and then affordability. overcrowding and rates of development.
That's right.
In a nutshell, have I got that?
Yes. So they are the indicators that are set out in PPG.
Yeah.
If I can put my finger on it, I think it's paragraph 18 or 19 of 2A.
It's fine, I'm familiar with that.
So that gives you a full set of all of the indicators that are listed there. It is paragraph 19 of the PPG. So it sets out each of the indicators. It sets out the rate of change, the absolute, the relative to England, as required by the PPG. It also goes and compares with similar demographic and economic areas that were identified as part of the original SHMA. And then I think that following on from the hearings last time, you requested that we also provide information on the surrounding areas to give you that wider context. And whilst the PPG doesn't specifically reference the surrounding areas, obviously it is helpful to understand how North Hertfordshire sits within that grouping. And what we have done is we've set out in the last two lines there, the uplift to housing need that was applied in those particular areas and the status of that as to whether or not it had been endorsed by the local plan inspector or whether or not it was still a proposed number. And what we can see is that for North Hertfordshire, or firstly, we had proposed an overall uplift of 10% across both North Hertfordshire and Stevenage, recognising that it was for the housing market area as a whole. And in terms of the figures, as you can see there, North Hertfordshire is broadly less expensive, and the affordability is better than in East Hertfordshire and in Cambridge, and where the uplifts were 30% and 14%, and broadly is less expensive than South Cambs as well, where the uplift of 10% was endorsed. It is marginally more expensive or less affordable than Aylesbury Vale, and the Aylesbury and Vale inspector endorsed an uplift of 17%, following an adjustment there. He chose to take a higher number, and it is more expensive than Milton Keynes and Luton at 10%. And the Bedford number has now been endorsed at 5%, as was the Huntingdonshire number. So it is a judgment as to what the right number is. As I say, originally the 10% encapsulated the suppressed household formation, but given sort of where North Hertfordshire sits relative to the other areas, we would consider that 10% is still an appropriate number, rather than us looking to go with a very specific or precise adjustment. And obviously that is 10% then, which has been applied to the household projections after taking account of suppressed household formation.
So in summary then, and tell me if I've got any of this wrong, I think what you're saying is that PPG tells us that we need to consider whether or not an uplift is needed for market signals or not. The PPG, did you say this? I'm not sure. I'll put it as a question in case you didn't. Is it then the PPG that tells us what things we should consider to be market signals? What specific things we need to look at?
Yes,
the PPG tells us that.
The PPG specifically at paragraph 19 goes and says that we should consider a number of signals and relevant signals. It says relevant signals may include the following. We have land prices, which we don't have data for, but then house prices, which we do have data for, rents, which we have data for, and affordability, which we have data for, and then rates of development and overcrowding, which we have data for, and all 5 of those different metrics are presented within the table. Then at paragraph 20, PPG goes on to say appropriate comparisons of indicators should be made. This includes comparison with longer term trends, both in absolute levels and rates of change in the housing market area, similar demographic and economic areas, and nationally. And obviously we've set out those different metrics for the different indicators for each of those comparators. What the PPG actually then goes on to say is a worsening trend in any of these indicators will require upward adjustment to planned housing numbers. Now, that is actually quite prescriptive insofar as you've got quite such a large basket of indicators. Any one of them going in an upward direction requires you to make an upward adjustment. And we've taken that generally in a more holistic position whereby we look at the indicators as a whole. But I think that it's reasonable to say that on the basis of the indicators, it is appropriate for an upward adjustment to the numbers to be applied. And then PPG carries on to say in areas where an upward adjustment is required, plan makers should set this adjustment at a level that is reasonable. I think it finally goes on, it says the numbers aren't exhaustive. Plan makers should not attempt to estimate the precise impact of an increase in housing supply. Rather, they should increase planned supply by an amount that, on reasonable assumptions and consistent with principles of sustainable development, could be expected to improve affordability and monitor the response of the market over the plan period. So it's warning against being unduly precise in this, which is why we're in a position whereby we've taken a 10% adjustment consistent with the position that we took originally, given the relative position of North Hertfordshire and Stevenage housing market area in that hierarchy of figures that have been examined elsewhere.
Okay, thank you. Mr. Berend.
Thank you, sir. Let me just start my video. Thank you. Just on this point, I think, well, on previous points, actually, I would just like to say up to this stage, we would support what the council's done in terms of what Mr. Lee is suggesting with regard to the starting point and suppressed households. If the houses haven't been built, there's no way that that those households could form. And I think this is also part of the wider issue with regard to the level of affordability and the need for a market signals adjustment. This is a separate issue to the suppression, and that's clearly set out within PPG. But what we do see is a worsening trend within affordability. And just taking just one of those indicators, because PPG does confirm that it's any of those indicators where it's a worsening trend, and you look at lower quartile affordability ratios, which is one that's often used, and that has worsened and now is 11 times salary compared to, I think that I say in my statements, the previous high prior to the recession in 2008 was around about 9. So what you're seeing is a worsening trend up to this point. There has been a slight improvement in the latest figures compared to 2018 compared to 2019, and that's recognised, but the trend is one that is worsening. In terms of what that means in terms of the judgments that made, is that the council need to look at that and say, actually, it's worsening. Is 10% sufficient? Obviously, the council says we would argue that actually the very act of government introducing the standard method, which looks at far greater uplifts and the need to move away from the OAN and the relatively low uplifts that were being provided across many places, into that is an indicator that actually the considerations of many, especially the 10% we're seeing in situations such as North Herts, were too low. I recognise that actually the 40% includes things like suppression of past delivery and everything else, encompassing within a whole market signals uplift, as it were, within that standard method. But it does suggest that 10% is too low within that, and actually it should be higher, and we would suggest about a 20% ratio. This is more in line with later plans coming forward later and being examined later, whereas such as Runnymede, where you have an affordability ratio of around about 11 or 12, and that was a 20% uplift that was being suggested within that area. So what you do have is plans being examined post this being having higher levels of market signals uplift. So I think that is also an important consideration to make, sir, within this this consideration. Thank you very much.
Thank you. Ms. Sananda.
Hi, yeah, I suppose I'm just really concerned at having, if the market uplift, first of all, includes suppressed households, we're already adding a huge number in this methodology, well, a large number, should we say, for suppressed households, and then going on to use the 10%. That just strikes me as double counting. We should either be consistent with the last methodology, or actually perhaps we should move to the new government methodologies. This is, it was always a bit of a pickle, was my sense of, from the original document, HOU4, that we presented lots and lots of data and then ultimately said, oh, let's call it 10%. Now that 10% at least covered the suppressed households. But market signals are surely about not being able to afford houses, which results in suppressed households. So actually putting on another 10% on top of the suppressed household figure, it's just, to me, it's just like finding fudge factors so we don't have to change the housing need based on the 2018 data. And I really am losing confidence in the analysis here and the methodology. It's like, it's just not following, a sensible, consistent process to me. And I just feel we should watch out for double counting going on here to get the numbers up. And the other thing I actually wanted to say as well was, in the 2014 analysis based on 2014 data said, at 2011, we had 309 suppressed households here and in Stevenage. Now that 2011 figure on the number of households is consistent between the 2018 data and the 2014. It's historic, like the lady was talking about earlier. So how did that number go from 309 to 797? It's, when it's historic, I can understand a difference in methodology going forward, but two different ways have been used to analyse what it were the suppressed households at the start of this plan period and produced two different results. And then we're going on and talking about the market signals. It's becoming very, very difficult, I imagine, for most people to follow this now, which maybe is why the government's produced a newer methodology that is much more transparent. I think that's what I want to say on it.
Thank you. Mr. Norgan.
Yes, hello. I feel as though Mr. Lee doesn't really understand affordability in the housing market, which is a bit strange, really, coming from him. Because the affordability of houses is not very closely tied to their market value. Affordability really, I think, rests upon the size of the deposit that somebody has to find in order to put down to buy one. And at the present time, the banks, instead of wanting 5% deposit, they want either 15% and sometimes as much as 20%. So the average house price around this area, I think, is £300,000. That means the deposit could be up to £60,000. And I don't think too many people have got £60,000 in their pocket. So the affordability is actually very bad for people at the present time. And if I read an article by Oxford Economics about what happened in the crash 2007 to 2008, when in fact the interest rates went up and the affordability went very bad during that time. And what actually happened was that home ownership, which in 2003 was 70.5%, fell to 63.1% by 2016. So under these similar conditions, there's going to be less demand for houses considerably so, I would think. So I would have thought that the market signals were highly negative. And in fact, the house building industry itself recognizes this, because the house building industry, according to Knight Frank, is expected to be building 35% less houses this year. And the Construction Products Association predicts that new housing starts will be only 40% of last year's numbers in 2021. So the house building industry is actually assuming that they will need less houses built. So I would say the market signals ought to be negative. Now, what Mr. Lee was saying is that it appears from the government guidance that you can only have uplifts rather than whatever the opposite of an uplift is. But it doesn't seem to make any sense to build houses that people cannot afford. So I think it should be minus. I think it should be something like minus 10%, probably even worse than that, actually. Okay, that's what I had to say.
Thank you, Morgan. Right, I can see I've got a number of other hands up now. I am, though, going to take a break for lunch. So I make it 11 minutes past 1. I'm going to adjourn then until 2 o'clock. So if I can do that, I now adjourn the hearings to resume at 2 o'clock. And if I could remind everyone, please just to switch their microphones and cameras off during the lunch break. Thank you.
Hello, Inspector.
Hi, Louise.
Everybody has to log out and log into a different invitation, and they've all got this afternoon's invitation.
Ah, that's my fault. I told everyone to do precisely the opposite.
I know you did. That's why we just intervened. So I don't think we've lost everybody. I think most people are still here with any luck. Don't think anybody's gone yet.
Yeah. So, yeah. Oh dear. Right. Sorry about that. My apologies.
That's okay. I'll be here if anybody says, "Oh dear, I can't get in." I think they'll realise what's happened. But it's easier to do that because we have other people who are joining this afternoon session who weren't able to get here for the morning, for example.